Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, good weekend. I don't know when you're listening to this. In any case, welcome to you. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. We've got a great podcast up ahead for you today, as always, I think anyway. We're going to be talking later on with Steven Crowder, the proprietor of LouderWithCrowder.com, Fox News contributor, a conservative comedian, talking to him about political correctness, and that's going to be somewhat of a theme for a couple of segments of this show here. He penned a blog post a couple of weeks ago that I think is so important. I think it should be mandatory reading by university students. He's writing about political correctness and its impact on communities. Not its impact on education, not its impact on government, not its impact on human resources, policies, and workplaces, but its interaction and its impact with your neighborhood, with the people that you know. And obviously this is coming from an American's point. Well, he's actually a Canadian originally, but an American resident's point of view. But lessons in there that I think we can all learn from. Also going to be talking later on about the mayor of Edmonton dancing on the grave of a police officer with his anti-gun nonsense. That's coming up later on as well. And also going to be talking about a project in Toronto that will bring back racially segregated education. And this is in the name of progress. I know. That's coming up later on as well. But I wanted to mention something that I said a couple of moments ago. Keeps in a theme with political correctness for the show today for a little bit of it. And it's actually, in all honesty, a surprise to me that a liberal Jewish comedian, these are our three groups in the entertainment industry that generally never side politically or ideologically with things that are important to me. But Jerry Seinfeld had my back. Now, I'm a big fan of Jerry Seinfeld. I'm a big fan of the show Seinfeld. But you may have seen the viral comments made by Seinfeld this week making their way around the internet when he basically said that politically correct college students, quote, don't know what the hell they're talking about, unquote. And I don't think this should come as anyone, certainly not to me as news. But I think it's interesting that even in Hollywood, you're starting to see a little bit of pushback on here. And I'm going to play a couple of clips for you that I think, well, first off, are going to kickstart a great discussion here. And these are our clips from Jerry Seinfeld. One of them is the one that went viral from this past week. He was doing an interview with ESPN Radio's Colin Cowherd, and the comedian was talking about a joke made by Conan O'Brien. Now, I didn't actually hear the joke, but it was about apparently transgender issues or cross-dressing issues, whatever the case may be. And the joke came out a couple of days before Bruce Jenner's interview, or Caitlyn Jenner's interview with Diane Sawyer. And what Colin Cowherd had said was that if you had made this joke 2 days after the interview, it would not have been as well received nor as acceptable as it was beforehand without necessarily a direct line being drawn between the joke and another thing. So not knowing the context of that, I wasn't even interested in that part of the discussion, but it was what Seinfeld said after that I wanted you to hear.
Does the climate worry you now? I've talked to Chris Rock and Larry the Cable Guy. They don't even want to do college campuses anymore.
I hear that all the time. I don't play colleges, but I hear a lot of people tell me don't go near colleges. They're so PC. Here, I'll give you an example. My daughter's 14. My wife says to her, well, you know, in the next couple of years, I think maybe you're going to want to hang around the city more on the weekends so you can see boys. You know, my daughter says, she says, that's sexist.
Isn't that, you know, it's amazing.
That they just want to use these words. That's racist. That's sexist. That's prejudice. They don't even know what they're talking about.
Does it hurt comedy?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Artie Lang said this the other day. He said, I got nothing against Bruce Jenner, but can't I have 5 or 6 seconds to kind of figure out how to contextualize it? I do need a little time. I can't see him on the cover of a magazine and then immediately be, okay, I'm going to embrace this. He goes, don't I get 5 seconds anymore to kind of go, all right, let me get my... Louis C.K. went on Saturday Night Live. It was controversial. You've stayed away from controversy, but Louis does a lot of theater stuff. I wonder if it worries Louis.
No. Louis' great gift is he doesn't worry. He just does his thing. If I wanted to say something, I would say it. You got to go. Everybody has their hot zone. You got your heat map, and that's the jokes you do. For me, it's the subject. I talk about the subjects I talk about because for some reason I can make them funny. The ones I can't make funny, you don't hear.
That was Jerry Seinfeld on ESPN Radio. And I'm going to play another clip of Seinfeld's very shortly, but I wanted to disseminate that very briefly. This is what you do to comedy. You take the fun out of it by disseminating it. But Jerry Seinfeld has always been a non-offensive comedian as far as I'm concerned. He's always been non-controversial. That doesn't mean that his show, which covered a lot of things, didn't touch on controversial topics. It absolutely did. Heck, it had me, a pro-life Christian, in hysterics when it tackled the question of abortion from that famous episode, where they're debating when is a pizza a pizza. Well, no, it's a pizza the minute you put your hands in the dough. I can't do a good Poppy impression, but you'll know the episode, hopefully, and I hope I didn't ruin it for you by that accent. But they tackled big issues, and I wonder if Seinfeld today in 2015 would have the same impact that it was. Because remember, comedy has gotten a lot less clever. Comedy has gotten a heck of a lot less clever than it used to be, because now comedy is about fart jokes and F-bombs and physical comedy and then non sequiturs, like in Family Guy, the scene's dried up, so let's just put in a random scene of Peter fighting a chicken. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean I don't find those things funny. But absolutely, when you look at how much of modern comedies, especially movies, are expecting laughs that are predicated on dick jokes, I think that this tells us something that's very significant, whereas Seinfeld had a cleverness to it, and that still exists in comedy. I think the best comedy is comedy that doesn't require a shock and awe factor or gut-wrenching. It's comedy that stands on its own merits. But what's interesting is that now so many people are just so hypersensitive. And what Seinfeld alluded to in that interview, which I think is so very important here, is that ground zero for that attitude is college students or university campuses or teenagers. He's talking about his own daughter that told his mother that it was sexist that she might want to hang out with boys when she was a couple of years older. And I think the latter part of his comment is great here, and something that so many people need to note, that these kids just want to use these words. They just want to say that's sexist. They just want to say that's racist, because it's almost empowering in a way. You're fighting for social justice. You're calling out evil in the world. You've said something's racist, therefore you can sleep at night because you've done your part to make the world a better place. And it's no different than when we look at things like affirmative action. Some people say, well, it's racist if you don't want to hire the black person. It's racist if you don't want to hire the woman. Whereas I say, no, it's all about who's going to do the best job. And the reason I bring up affirmative action is to segue into this second clip. Now, this was from Seinfeld a year ago. Now, I had never seen this until recently. I only found this just the other day, as a matter of fact. But it's Jerry saying something very similar to what he said in the clip we just played. And this was responding to allegations that his web series, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, didn't have enough diversity in it. The host was criticizing Seinfeld, saying that, hey, you should have had more people of color, more minorities. The host was relaying comments that were apparently tweeted to him of people saying, well, you need to have more minorities on there. And thankfully, Seinfeld doesn't seem to have any time for that.
There were a lot of things about Comedians in Cars in the beginning. The first 10 I did, I think, were all white males. And people were writing all about that, which
that's part of the reason why I asked. People had tweeted at me when I said I'm interviewing with Jerry Seinfeld. Okay, ask him about the gender diversity on the show.
Yeah, I mean, people think it's the census or something. I mean, this has got to represent the actual pie chart of America. Who cares? It's just funny. Funny is the world that I live in. You're funny, I'm interested. You're not funny, I'm not interested. Okay. And I have no interest in gender or race or anything like that, but everyone else is kind of with their little calculating, is this the exact right mix? I think that's to me, it's anti-comedy. It's
Okay.
anti-comedy. It's more about, PC nonsense than are you making us laugh or not?
Right.
And interestingly enough, when he says anti-comedy, I'm getting instant flashbacks to that other Seinfeld episode of the anti-dentite. When he was talking about the dentist who had converted to Judaism and was making Jewish jokes, and he was confessing to a priest about this, and a priest had said, "Oh, and this offends you as a Jewish person." He said, "No, it offends me as a comedian." And here's why I think that in a lot of ways, comedy has to be something where there are no limits. And I don't mean that every individual comedic act should have no limits. But the second you start parsing something like that, the second you start going down the road of wondering, oh my goodness, is this offensive? Is this offensive? You are robbing the one last bastion of politically correctness or political correctness free speech, which is basically comedy. And I can't think of another area of the world, and I may be wrong, and even as I'm talking, something may come, but I cannot think of another area of the world that has been as relatively free as stand-up comedy is to not being influenced by political correctness. And I'm not including sitcoms in that category, which have gone through the ringer of censors for years. I'm not talking about movies, which sometimes push the envelope, but stand-up. And this is, in a lot of ways, the one type of TV programming that I can always tolerate. I mean, you look at the Comedy Central roasts, and admittedly, they've gone downhill in the last few years with some of the guests they've had and some of the roastees they've had. But, I mean, you have comedians like Nick DiPaolo, you have comedians like the late Greg Giraldo, you have comedians like Jeff Ross that can make the jokes about anything, about anyone, even Whitney Cummings, who I find to be absolutely humorless. Certainly I feel humorless when I'm listening to her, has made jokes at the expense of these so-called protected identity groups about whom we're not supposed to joke. And I don't think you need to do that, but I think you need to have a society that gives you the right to do that. And even comedy seems to be trying to now fight against this, which is really good. And this is where, even when you look at liberal Hollywood, even when you look at the left-wing cesspool that is the entertainment industry, the comedians are often the ones that stand out. They're often the ones that stand out as not being a part of that. I mean, you got Adam Carolla, who I don't think is a lefty. He's a bit more of a libertarian. You have your people like Lisa Lampanelli. You have all these people that I think are outside of that bubble, which is so important because that bubble suffocates freedom. That bubble suffocates discourse. And I hope it holds out. I sincerely hope it holds out. Because you know what Seinfeld was mentioning and starting off that interview that I played first by discussing was the attitude of this prevailing on college campuses. And there was another viral piece that went around the internet not long ago. I think it was about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, by a pseudonymous author. I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me. And the professor said he's a professor at a mid-sized state school. He said he's been teaching university classes for 9 years, and he said that his liberal students terrify him. And he didn't mean in a sense of his physical safety, but in their unwillingness or inability to hear anything that challenges. Anything that remotely comes close to challenging the things that they believe in, the values that they hold true. And of course, then people started to jump on this and say, oh, well, this is probably fake and we can't believe this and yada, yada, yada. But I do believe it. I do believe it because I've seen the rampant liberalism that exists on campuses. I've seen how professors cower in the face of it. You know, I knew one professor, I actually had him as a professor in political science a couple years in university. He was a dyed-in-the-wool NDP supporting socialist for his whole life. And he said that what changed things for him was seeing how affirmative action was playing into other colleagues, less accomplished, less experienced, and less talented professors getting tenured positions and getting better positions just because they checked off the boxes. He talked about one time, this professor who had like 2 years experience or 3 years experience or whatever the case may be, who was a female lesbian minority, and she was getting thrown into these giant like ball pits full of grants and things like just play with what you want, take what you want, it's all yours. And he saw this, and he said other professors saw this. And this is part of the culture, not only in how universities are run, but also in the type of people who are going to them. I'm sure I've quoted it on the podcast before. If I have, listen up again, because it's important. If I haven't, then, well, here you go. Kate McMillan, blogger at Small Day and Animals, once coined the phrase that the opposite of diversity is university. And I don't think that a simpler way and a more accurate way to encapsulate the perils of post-secondary education has been said or written before. It's dominated by people that want to appear to be social justice warriors rather than people that want to become productive members of society. The degree is less to those who get it about what you've learned and how smart you are, and more about how you've attempted to transform society, combat the patriarchy, and stick it to the man, and I'm sure they probably would love it. Absolutely love it if you could just put the degree hung up on the wall beside the giant picture of Che Guevara. Seriously. Just look around. It's got to be the most popular shirt on a university campus. I would love to see, by the way, here's an idea for my Rebel colleagues. Take a video camera to campuses and start quizzing anyone you see wearing this shirt. Wait until September. The weather will still be warm. Quizzing them about what he actually was. Who he was. You know, it's like one of my favorite t-shirts. Communism killed 100 million people and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. But here we have what Seinfeld mentioned, what I think a lot of other people have thought, if not said, which is that accusations of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, these are not used because they make sense. They're not used because they fit. They're used because they silence the other person. They're used to quash debate and discussion and discourse and enact victory. Perceived moral victory is what the left wants. And the reason they get it is by shutting other people up. And the way you shut people up is by accusing them of some sort of ism or phobia. Because no one wants to be one of those. No one wants to be a racist, a homophobe, a transphobe. No one wants to be a bigot. No one wants to be these things. And it used to affect me a lot more when someone would say something like that, because you take it to heart. You can't help it. It's human nature. You wonder, well, wait. I mean, what did I say that was racist? And then I don't know when the turning point was. It happened years ago, early on in my blogging career, long before I worked in radio. And other people have gone through this transformation themselves, where you realize that it doesn't matter what you say. It matters what someone else hears, or what someone else thinks they hear, or what someone else thinks they can pretend they heard. And it's a culture that has legitimized the so-called microaggression, which is the belief that you don't actually have to have been aggressive. You just have to have done something that someone can say felt aggressive. The reality in which one's feelings trump the actual reality. It basically solidifies and codifies the old adage that perception is reality. And this is now being legislated into existence. You look at company workplace violence and harassment policies. You look at affirmative action. You look at all of these different criterias that now put these so-called microaggressions on equal footing of actual violence. I mean, heck, look at the retaliation against Lauren Southern, a Rebel commentator, when she questioned the mainstream media's narrative and the slutwalk narrative at a slutwalk event out west by saying that rape culture doesn't exist. And rape culture doesn't exist. This is the whole point. You have rape or you have no rape. This is a binary. That there is some sort of cultural force that is leading to rape that is rooted in language is as asinine a suggestion as to say that Justin Trudeau loves Canada. I mean, it just does not compute. And I think that this is laughable in so many ways, that we have now accepted this and allowed this to dominate, allowed this to be the norm, allowed this to become the status quo. And I have to say, good for Seinfeld for speaking out against it, because obviously there are any number of his colleagues in Hollywood that will say, heck no. Heck no, that's not what we think. That's not what we believe. No, we love universities, we love liberalism, and we love not offending people. But thank goodness for comedy, because someone has to stand out against this. Someone has to speak out against this. And who would have thought that the battle against censorship would be fought by comedians? I mean, even authors in a lot of cases, even writers. And we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, talking about the Charlie Hebdo award that it was being given at the Penn event in Washington, D.C. And you have authors that are saying, well, we can't award someone who offends people. Authors who, in another era, would have been leading the charge against censorship in all forms, including the self-imposed censorship that is now the biggest threat. Not government censorship. Self-imposed censorship is the biggest threat to discourse, and the social shaming that goes along if someone does not, in fact, censor themselves the way that the PC doctrine dictates. We've got to take a break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media.
Welcome back to Lawton Online. It's time for what apparently is a new segment we do in the podcast. I didn't know this, but Mayors Who Don't Understand Guns. That's the name of the segment, Mayors Who Don't Understand Guns. We had the inaugural edition of this segment, unbeknownst to me that it would become a segment when the mayor of Hamilton a couple of weeks ago had suggested that after a shooting that happened in his city's downtown, that the city should ban guns. And you may remember I railed against him quite viciously for quite a while. The latest installment actually comes, embarrassingly enough, from Edmonton, where the mayor, Don Iveson, earlier this week, made an asinine and boneheaded comment under very similar circumstances to the mayor of Hamilton that shows how little he doesn't understand guns, but more importantly shows how much he's willing to politicize a tragedy. There was, as you know, a tragic case where an Edmonton police officer was shot at what started off as a routine call and later ended up with one officer being shot and hospitalized before being released and another being killed. Sergeant Jason Harley was shot, but is expected to make a full recovery, and the other sergeant, Daniel Woodall, 35, was killed, and it was basically executing an arrest warrant as part of a hate crimes investigation that led to the shootout that ended up taking his life. And this was wall-to-wall news, as it is whenever a police officer dies, for the whole day when it happened on Tuesday morning. And even since then, there's been a lot of discussion about what this means, about the significance of this. And Don Iveson was taking questions from a reporter who had asked him, quote, "Are you concerned that something is happening in the city or in the province in regard to violence against police?" Reasonable enough question. And in one sentence, any respect or indifference that I had towards Don Iveson became an abject contempt for his position. He said, quote, "I do have a concern with gun violence, and I will say that the loss of the gun registry may be related to this. I think every opportunity our police have to knowledge of where firearms are in the city would be to their advantage, and the chiefs of police have been consistent about that," unquote. Let me just repeat one key part of that quote. "I will say that the loss of the gun registry may be related to this," unquote. Just imagine if people in media would come out and say, you know, this person may be connected to this crime. You know, this person may have done this. This mayor of this city in Edmonton may be a moron. I'm not saying he is. I'm not saying anyone is, but I'm saying he may be. No, that is a bit of a cop-out. And by the way, the gun registry may help police in investigating things, but a gun registry doesn't mean that someone can't shoot a gun. A gun registry doesn't mean that someone can't fire their firearm, legal or illegal. keeping in mind that a gun registry is not likely to be used by someone who's evading arrest warrants and has firearms that, again, I don't know, but may not be legal, to follow from the school of Don Iveson on this respect. Now, he apologized for this a couple hours later. He wrote, quote, speculation, and this was on Twitter, where, all heartfelt apologies are penned. Quote, speculation about gun registry this morning was premature. Focus should remain our condolences and safety of Edmonton Police Service members and public. Apologies, unquote. Now, in fairness, the character limit may have been causing him issues more than the actual lack of words to come up with to encapsulate his regret, but I'd say try harder. Because when you make a comment like that, a comment supporting the gun registry, especially, a police officer's body is not even cold yet. When you do that, when you do such a thing, you are actually condemning all law-abiding gun owners. You're condemning people like me that would never harm someone, that would never kill a police officer, that would never discharge my firearm in an unlawful manner. Because that's what the long gun registry did. It took people like me and treated us like criminals in waiting. Like murderers waiting for a victim. That's what the registry does. Now, I understand him being emotional. I understand anyone being emotional. I understand the chief of police who lost an officer being upset, unhappy, concerned, scared, inquisitive even at how such a thing could be dealt with and addressed and prevented in the future. And I understand and respect those concerns in Mayor Iveson as well. No mayor wants to see their city plagued with public safety issues. My city, London, Ontario, has a police chief who's only been on the job since May 1st. And what's interesting about him is that he's had to respond now to 5 stabbings in the last few months and try to tell people that, hey, there's no public safety issue. This is a concern for him. And Iveson is in a very similar boat. He has to tell people, no, the city's not safe. Or not unsafe, rather. Freudian slip, I apologize. See, it's not hard. You apologize right when you do something, not hours later. But I don't know why. I do know why. It's because of liberalism, but I don't know why reasonably intelligent people still find themselves able and willing to condemn gun ownership, condemn gun owners, when there has been no mark and no correlation in the long gun registry and actual crime. Have you noticed there hasn't been an increase or a decrease in crime since the long gun registry was abolished? No, all that's been done away with are regulatory infractions by people that had better things to do than register their firearms. And I find it to be fascinating that government thinks killing is going to be somehow eliminated, abolished, reduced, and dispatched to oblivion because of asking people to fill out a form. As though that is enough to combat crime, the desire for criminals to commit crime, the desire for people who have already shown a disregard for the law to actually change anything. It's such a jejune and naive belief that the gun registry solves problems. And then even now, to try to launch into a defense of that, a desire for the restoration of that, based off of a tragedy that has the whole nation looking at Edmonton. And that's what you do with the attention. Not to espouse your gratitude and your gratefulness and graciousness for people like Constable Woodall, but to say that this could have been prevented if there was a long gun registry into effect. That's how you utilize your platform. Disgusting. And he said apologies for, quote, speculation, unquote, about gun registry. It wasn't a speculation. It was an endorsement of the long gun registry, which is, first off, not a municipal issue. Secondly, already decided by Parliament. And thirdly, in no way appropriate while families are still mourning, while police officers are still mourning, while your colleague, the chief of police, is still mourning. And Iveson gets up there, claims that he is mourning as well, and I believe that. I believe that it affects him. I believe that it impacts him, but still manages to find it in his heart to make a political statement. A political statement that is unpopular to most Canadians, to all law-abiding gun owners, who, by the way, have more of a vested interest in responsible gun ownership than anyone else does, than any government agency, than any government office, and certainly more than Don Iveson. Because law-abiding gun owners want gun ownership to be protected as a right in Canada. And the way we do this is by making sure that people within our own ranks are not abusing that right. And the registry treats everyone as though they are a criminal. There's no other way around that. And I find it particularly despicable, especially when you see Bill Blair, another former Toronto police chief, who is actually running for the Liberals now, who's also come out in support of this. When he was the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, he said that officers in rural and urban environments used the registry to help keep communities safe. He said, quote, "It worked exceptionally well for us," and said that it would directly impact our ability to conduct criminal investigations and keep our officers and communities safer. Yet somehow I don't recall any rampant issues of officers being unsafe after the abolition of the long gun registry in 2012. I don't remember, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Bill Blair wants to correct me here. In that case, my email is andrew@andrewlawton.ca, Chiefy. But I don't recall there being an influx in the number of crimes against police officers in the absence of the gun registry. Police officers are trained to be vigilant. And I would ask, if I had the opportunity to talk to Bill Blair right now, I would ask him this question. Okay, as a police officer, you search the registry. You see there is a firearm registered to 123 Maple Street. You go in there expecting it. Great. Regardless of whether or not the person in 123 Maple Street is planning on using it on you, you are vigilant, you are diligent, and you are prepared. Are you any less prepared if that house does not show up as having a firearm? Are you any less prepared if 123 Maple Street shows no firearm in the registry? Do you then assume, well, I guess there's not a gun there then? If so, there's a serious lapse in the training that is offered to police officers. I think they need to be prepared that there could be danger around every corner when you're going into someone's home. Yeah, I remember years ago, I was on Michael Corrin's show on CTS every week, and there was this one panel where this lovely, lovely young woman who later became and still is a school board trustee in Mississauga. She was by trade a social worker, and she was talking to me as a liberal about, I mean, she was a liberal, certainly not me, about the long gun registry, and she's saying how necessary it was. And this is before it was abolished. And she said that as a social worker, she would even find it so valuable if she had access to it, going into a home for a home visit, especially where there may be family violence, to be able to see if there is a firearm registered. And I must say, I suggested something on air, and if the video was still around, I'd love to watch it because I'm pretty sure that she almost turned purple afterwards. I said the solution to that would be social workers packing heat. I said, give social workers concealed carry permits so that they can protect themselves on the job. And I'm pretty sure I could hear the gasket blowing in her mind and in any liberal who may have been watching that TV broadcast. And I said it for effect, absolutely, but the sentiment was true. Which is that, yes, the long gun registry does not protect you. The long gun registry gives you knowledge, but that knowledge is as good as people's ability or willingness to contribute to that base of knowledge, which was not universal and was not widely embraced by criminals, thus making the registry only a tool to impact and stymie the gun ownership of those abiding by the law. And the reason I talk about a lot of these arguments, which, yes, are well established and well embraced by now, are that these apparently did not factor in and did not enter into Don Iveson's mind when he decided that he would utilize this national tragedy to pontificate on gun ownership, which apparently is a right that he does not value to the extent of what Canadians value and what Canadian law respects and what Parliament respects, which is that this is not something that makes you a bad person. This is not something that makes you someone about whom the state should be skeptical. This is something that makes you a hunter, a hobby shooter, a farmer, someone who wants to protect your property, someone who wants to protect your crops. Someone like me who just enjoys firearms, someone who just enjoys target shooting, someone who just enjoys partaking in this hobby like so many other Canadians. and like millions of Americans. And the fact that we have more long guns per capita than any other country in the world, in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, suggests that maybe there's a bit of a gap if, despite that, the long gun registry still didn't manage to reduce crime because, well, crime's already on the decline, first off. And secondly, and most importantly, paperwork does not solve crime. Paperwork does not prevent crime. My heart goes out to Constable Woodall. I don't think any change in law or change in policy is going to make it any easier for his family, for his colleagues, for the police force. I don't know why Don Iveson is fickle enough to think that a change in policy would make things better. We got to take a break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at AndrewLawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Is political correctness ruining your neighborhood? It's a very specific question, but I think it's a really valuable one. And the reason I actually thought of it was because of a blog post written by my friend and colleague Stephen Crowder. He's, I think, appeared on Gavin McInnes's podcast here on The Rebel not long ago. And he penned a piece calling exactly what I just mentioned. Political correctness is ruining your neighborhood. And I feel it's so important to reference here and to acknowledge, because what he's talking about, and you can check it out at his blog, and we'll talk about it with him in a moment, are the fears and sensitivities and people being offended, these phenomena that have plagued something far more important and something far more pertinent than I think a lot of people recognize political correctness has done. We talk about, the impact it's had on education, on media, politics, government, etc. But what about the interactions that people have in their day-to-day lives, the interactions that you have when you're talking to someone at the corner, when you're talking to someone in a store, etc. Stephen Crowder joins me on the line. Stephen, it's great to talk to you again. Welcome to Lawton Online.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back.
I got to ask you, because you wrote this piece and shared it on social media recently, and it's getting a lot of feedback, a lot of great comments on it. I was wondering if you could walk me and my listeners through what happened to you that put you on this topic.
Well, it's stuff that happens to me every day, Andrew. I mean, we're not like super close friends, but we've hung out quite a bit. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm a double-edged sword. I mean, I'm a liability, right? I talk to everybody. I've got a big mouth. I'm always talking. I'm always making small talk. It's who I am. I'm the kind of guy where a trip to the grocery store for milk can be a 30-minute conversation with the bag boy. And that's what inspired this, because I've found myself, especially in the last few months, Andrew, becoming more and more nervous and sensitive, and people are clammed up and they're afraid of either being offended or saying the wrong thing. I wrote it in this piece. I like laughing with kids. I like making faces, going blah, 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 sticking out my tongue. That's who I am. I like kids. I can't do it now for fear of stranger danger. I have to make sure that I don't use words like brother or amigo, which I use with my friends all the time because it could be culturally insensitive. And I really believe that political correctness, which of course is cultural Marxism, Andrew Breitbart spoke about that, is destroying American neighborhoods. People are more afraid and more divided than ever, and it's not because of an actual physical danger. It's because of this all-consuming fear of offending somebody, and I think it's terrible.
Yeah, and it's not exclusive to America. I'd argue it's been happening in Canada for far longer.
Yeah, maybe it has. I don't know. I mean, that's the difference between multiculturalism and the melting pot. In Canada, everyone actually has a legal right to being offended with hate speech laws. And in the United States, I kind of thought we had the First Amendment, which was supposed to curb that. Just because someone's offended, it doesn't mean they're right. And if you want to give you the personal story, what it really was when it was crystallized, I was walking out of my local Rite Aid. I live in a neighborhood where it's walkable, it's pretty diverse. I'm walking out, and the guy is tying up his bike on the bike rack. And he is clean-shaven, dressed to the nines. He's wearing a full-on suit and tie. And without even thinking, I just blurted out. I said, man, all decked out for an evening bike ride. I dig it. You're putting the rest of us to shame. It's a black man, I should say now. It shouldn't be relevant, but it is, because he turns to me and he goes, oh, man, Why you got to try and do me like that? Genuinely perturbed. And I remember thinking, like, well, now I have to clarify my position that I didn't mean any offense. And I'm thinking, well, why? Why? It was clearly meant to be a compliment. This guy is now offended. This should be a unifying experience. Hey, a compliment. A guy in your neighborhood who's cracking open a Diet Coke, who's talking to you, saying, hey, man, you look great. Instead, he was offended. And it just really upset me. It's one of those things, listen, I'm not a talking head policy guy. I'm a cultural guy. And to see this happening to this country, to see people avoiding each other, to see, honestly, Americans spitting on the absolute gift from God that is human interaction is it's more upsetting to me than the presidential race. It's more upsetting to me than Benghazi. It's more upsetting to me than political corruption, because this is destroying the fabric that is the country, and it really does ruin neighborhoods, regardless of where you are. If you're in the cities, if you're in the suburbs, if you're in the country, people are afraid of offending everyone else, and it makes us more distant and less human than ever before.
I guess what I don't get is, what did he think you were saying to him? Because you didn't use any of the so-called racial code words we're told exist. You told a guy that he's dressed nicely. Did he think you were racist for, commenting that, he as a black person couldn't have dressed nicely otherwise?
I have no idea. And I know that, my fault, even before that, I avoided saying brother. I mean, if you speak with me, I'm like, hey, how you doing? Great to see you, brother. Yeah, cool, Andrew. That's the way I talk. That's the way my dad raised me. It's the way we speak. It comes from old church lingo. And I even avoided saying that. You know what? After that, I said, hey, if people are going to be offended anyway, let them be offended at the real me. And that's what happened with me, on the website right now and leaving. I was talking about this. I don't do any media anymore unless it's a friend like you or Dana, because people can take things out of context, and people are looking for a reason to be offended. The problem is, Andrew, people aren't even really all that offended. I could walk up to that guy and probably make a racially tinged joke that would have us both laughing 10 years ago, and he could do it to me. I've had people, when I used to play basketball in the public courts there in Montreal, they talk about how white guys can't jump, and I would laugh and, make a joke back. Yeah, well, let's get in the Olympic swimming pool. It happened all the time. It was joshing around. People weren't offended. It was a joke. Nowadays, these people believe they're supposed to be offended by people orchestrating this sort of social justice lexicon who aren't offended. They're just telling people, hey, this is what you should be. This is what should offend you. Let's run down the list. And now people are buying it, because I genuinely don't believe that people are as offended as they're acting. And that's even more upsetting. And if you're genuinely offended because someone badmouths your wife, or because someone said something personal, or something that's clearly racist, yeah, that's always been a problem for as long as I've been alive. But now people are choosing to act like they're offended because it's how they've been told to react. And people can tweet me at S. Crowder. I may be out of line, but listen, I'm sick of it, and I actually have a heaviness on my heart. When I wrote this column, Andrew, I wrote it and my heart broke, and I'm just not going to play by the rules anymore. If people want to be offended, if people want to say I'm a racist, or if people want to say that I'm insensitive, they wouldn't say I'm a racist. I've never been accused of being a racist. I've been accused of being insensitive. And I always say, listen, either I'm an insensitive jackass, which I am, or I'm a bigot. It has to be one or the other, because if I'm insensitive, it's my lack of sensitivity to your race, gender, societal upbringing that makes me insensitive. I can't be discriminatory. It's one or the other. And listen, I choose to be the insensitive jackass who loves too much and trusts too much.
Well, I think there's also a distinction, or at least I thought up until reading your piece about there's a distinction between conversations that happen one-on-one between, in your case, just, people on the streets of the USA, and conversations that happen in media. Because when you're dealing with your world, certainly, I mean, either the entertainment side or the political side, you're dealing with people that are going to latch on to anything that, that guy on Fox News said, or latch on to anything that conservative comedian said. And, we're going to use this in some Media Matters piece and call them racist. But I've always thought that with one-on-one conversations, people were a lot more open. People were a lot more of what you described that was the case 10 years ago. And I guess what concerns me about this incident that you've written about and that you've shared with me and my listeners now is that now that sort of hair trigger reaction has migrated into neighborhood interactions. And that's terrifying.
It's not only terrifying, Andrew, and I don't mean to be one. I mean, listen, I'm an anti-sensationalist. If people listen to my show, it's a conversation in a living room with some guys and coffee. That's why I think people feel so disconnected. This is something I sort of spoke about with Andrew WK in the show. think about it. Back in the day, entertainment, if you look at like Steve Allen's show, or you look at, the Tonight Show, everything was, oh, hey, she got you, son. It was very, very big. It was very show businessy. Well, nowadays, and that's because they sat around the dinner table, they had dinner, they talked about their days, and then they watched the TV. Nowadays, people aren't having that dinner table conversation. Nowadays, people aren't having that conversation on their stoop. They're all looking down at their phones and their devices. And so if you notice, entertainment has become much more human. It's become much more laid back. I think that people are craving that human interaction, and that's this podcast phenomenon. That's this YouTube phenomenon, why they're destroying cable news, because people want what they don't get in real life. And that's really sad to me. It's not sad that there's a digital age and there's a new way to bypass the sort of information safeguards like there used to be with mainstream media, but it is sad that people are so afraid to interact. They feel safer behind their computer. And listen, I really want to say, it's not all is lost. The redeeming parts of that story, and people can see it on the website, is I was walking my dog. He's a Doggo Argentino, so I should say, for context, he's 90 pounds, stark white, literally completely white. And a black lady later on in the week pulled over, and he was dragging his feet because the temperature just changed, and so he's really big and looks like an athlete, but he's lazy. And she said, "Oh man, that dog ain't having none of that. He don't want to follow you today." And I said, "Yeah, well, he can get in line with everyone else." And she laughed. And I said, "Yeah, there he is, an all white dog bridging the racial divide." And she said, "Man, I like that. You have a good day, sir," and smiled. And I thought, wow, that was an interaction. We joked about something. No one was offended. She pulled over. That's the way it should be. Now, could you take that put it on paper and say, Stephen then said, an all-white dog bridging the racial divide? It would look terrible. It would look absolutely terrible. But Andrew, a conversation that's had between two people, it's not meant to be broadcast. That's why there are show maps. There's a disconnect from reality, and I hate that sort of, reality TV is seeping into reality subconsciously, and people think they need to act that way. And it's more sad to me than anything.
I guess the last question I'd ask you then, Stephen, is do you think we can put the genie back in the bottle on this? Do you think there's ever going to be an ability for us as a society, not even just you and I as individuals, but people in general, to return back to that way it was?
Gosh, that's a good question. You're kind of going Diane Sawyer on me. All I can, it's kind of, as for me in my house, we will serve the Lord, that old scripture. All I can do is control myself, and I'm not going to play by the rules. I'm not going to be afraid. I'm not going, I felt myself at one point, kind of like when I was doing the sort of, the media circuits back in the day, and I felt myself changing to adapt to what other people told me I should be. I felt that in my day-to-day interactions. I felt like, oh, I'm getting nervous. Oh, I'm not talking to the lady at the grocery store. Oh, I'm being careful as to what I say with my friends in the small group. And I've made the conscious decision, I'm not going to do that anymore. And sometimes people are shocked, but most of the time, Andrew, people react in a way where they seem to think it's refreshing, and I make more friends than I lose. So that's what I'll do myself, and I would encourage everyone out there listening to just give it a shot. Just stop being afraid. Stop being sensitive. I'm actually calling on Americans to be as insensitive as humanly possible and just try and reach out to people, see what happens.
And I'm calling on Canadians to do the same. Stephen Crowder, you can read his blog and lots of other great columns and videos and hear his podcast at louderwithcrowder.com. Stephen, appreciate your time as always. We'll talk to you soon, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
We've got to take a little bit of a break here, but please do look up that post at louderwithcrowder.com. The things he said are in a lot of ways, and I know I mentioned this, Tip, things that I've thought and felt, and I'm really glad that he's out there saying them and that I'm not alone. And I'm sure just from corresponding with a lot of you, these are things that you've experienced as well. More Lawton Online in just a couple of moments.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
We are back on Lawton Online here on TheRebel.media. Wanted to spend a few moments talking about this revolutionary, groundbreaking new school. I say that with all the sarcasm I can come up with. About Aboriginal issues. It's a new school in Toronto that's being proposed by the Toronto District School Board, the public school board there, for essentially Aboriginals only. Now, I should say with a proviso there that technically non-Aboriginals will be allowed to attend, but when you're creating a school that you say is about Aboriginals, for First Nations, for Indigenous students, you can't really expect it to be seen as anything but a segregationist school. Now, with that being said, the attitude behind this, the mentality behind this, is that this is a school for Aboriginal students who, according to some experts, are saying are alienated under the status quo, under the current education system. The dropout rate for Aboriginals is over 40%, which is about 4 times the national average for high school dropouts. And as a result, the school is saying, well, instead, we're going to focus on an education that values certain traditional Indigenous teachings. Like, for example, schools that partake in this model, if the pilot project is successful, and the pilot school itself will award credits for skills like hunting, which, frankly, I don't think is a bad idea necessarily, but awarding credits for things like hunting or Indigenous languages and literature, etc. Now, these are all part and parcel of Aboriginal culture, which is important. For the Aboriginal people, culture is important. Same as for Black people, their culture is important. For certain Middle Eastern people, culture is important. For Christians, culture, religion is important. But these aren't things that need to be hand-fed to you or spoon-fed to you by the government. These are things that should be preserved in your own home and your own family. That doesn't mean you should be denied the right to have your culture when you're in public, when you're in school. But changing the educational curriculum because you feel that someone is alienated by studies not being taught to them through the lens of their culture seems to be missing the mark. And it's not a new concept, by the way, no. There was a couple of years ago, remember, the pilot project also by the Toronto District School Board. It's almost as though Toronto is quite skilled at coming up with these ideas, had an Afrocentric school. This was something that was created under Dalton McGuinty's Ontario, an African-focused, Black-centric high school that ended up being a program of another school rather than a standalone school. Only 19 teens took part in it, the East Toronto High School, starting in grade 9, and it happened in Scarborough. Now, last year, halfway through the first year, the school said it was going to continue to accept students for the remaining years. This is still going on, despite the fact that it's a relatively small number of people that have embraced this. But what's a bit concerning is that people are trying to claim, participants in the program and proponents of the program were trying to claim that without a Black education, you would have no way of knowing that you could do things in your life. One grade 9 student said, quote, on TV, basically everyone's white. I mean, clearly they've never watched UPN. So you want to know if people from your background ever did something good other than Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela. Unquote. That was from Carl Lexina, 14 years old, who wanted to grow up and be a pediatrician. He said that his class took a field trip to a place near Chatham, Ontario, an early settlement for free slaves. She said no other class would learn what I'm learning. Only one member of the class is white. They said they're trying to address the, quote, opportunity gap facing some of the kids who aren't achieving. So here's the problem, is that they are saying that there's a problem that exists, a gap in the learning between what white students learn, or what white education teaches, rather, and what Black students will learn in a class that's focused on Black issues. But why do we not take that gap, if that truly does exist, and reform the mainline education system, reform the traditional education system? I'd say the same about this Aboriginal proposal for a kindergarten to grade 12 Aboriginal school. If kids are feeling they don't belong, why do we not include more teaching about Aboriginal history in the traditional education environment? I'd say because it doesn't matter. Because they're not looking for something that is actually going to teach culture to other people. They're looking for something that allows them to have a bit of a leg up given what they know about their own culture. If you are, for example, taught from a very young age things like drum circles and hunting, well, if you can do those things for school credit, then great, go for it. You know, I'd say the same thing to students who live in rural areas. You know, there's a rural high school near where I'm from where they actually have agriculture classes in school. But what about other high schools that have kids from rural backgrounds? Why not give them the opportunity to earn credits for showing off their farming knowledge? That's a part of their life. It's a part of their upbringing. And I guess my issue is that I'm not against Aboriginals having their own culture at home. I'm certainly not against them having it in school. But we need to be not accommodating people in such a sense that it creates a very unrealistic framework for later on in their lives. Here's the thing. There are schools already that offer similar programs to a shorter time frame, like, for example, kindergarten to grade 6 or kindergarten to grade 8 even. So kindergarten to grade 12, an Aboriginal-centric education, great. Well, what happens once you graduate? Do you require an Aboriginal-centric university degree? Do you require an Aboriginal-centric college diploma? Do you require an Aboriginal-centric workforce where instead you're rewarded not based on whether or not you can do traditional things like math and English, but whether or not you can hunt and partake in drum circles and read in Ojibwe and Cree? These are valuable skills, but there is, at the end of the day, a reintegration that needs to take place between Aboriginal students and the real world, like anyone else who graduates from school. And frankly, it's no different than what I've talked about on past episodes of the show and on my radio show about the need for us to not dilute the math curriculum, not dilute the English curriculum, not make it easier for students to pass at the expense of what they're actually expected to learn, because there is going to be a point where all of a sudden they realize they're faced with the reality that they're unprepared for the real world. Now, the bit of optimism I have about the First Nations school is that they're not actually trying to replace traditional things in the curriculum with these Aboriginal studies. That's what I'm told. But if that is, in fact, the case, then I have one very big question. Why can this not just be an after-school program or a before-school program or a lunchtime program? Why do you need to apparently to have students not dropping out of high school, need to pull them out of school and give them a new school? And that would be true of any group. Now, I don't know what the solution is. I don't know why Aboriginal students drop out at 4 times the rate of the rest of Canadians. But I do know that it's a problem. I know that any high school student dropping out, unless they're doing it because they're inventing, the MacBook Pro or something, I think that's a problem. So I don't want what I'm saying to be mistaken for a sense of apathy towards these students. But a lot of them are dropping out because of family issues. A lot of them are dropping out because if you look at statistics, Aboriginals have a lot more problems, demographically speaking, like, for example, broken families, alcoholism. These are things that factor in and can rear themselves in these people at a very young age. I'm not sure the problem is that they don't feel included in their education. I actually spoke on News Talk 770, which I was guest hosting a show on earlier this week, with one of the women behind this. And I asked her, why do this if it means that students are then going to have to be faced with this culture shock when they're going to go to university and not have an Aboriginal-centric approach. And she called the question ridiculous. And I didn't ask it in a combative way. I didn't ask it in a rude way. I asked her because I genuinely want to know what mechanisms are there to allow students to deal with this afterwards. And it was said to be a ridiculous question. And I know that this is so vastly removed from residential schools. I'm not at all conflating these two issues, but I find it interesting that we're now looking at the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Basically, the analysis of Canada's shameful history with residential schools, which I believe has been misappropriated as cultural genocide. I don't believe that the term genocide applies here, but I don't want to split hairs on that particular issue at this time. But we're seeing a lot of discussion and dialogue around First Nations issues through the TRC. And good, we need dialogue on these issues. We have reserves that basically look like ghettos and slums. You have people that are denied opportunities for success. You have a lot of polarized and antagonistic views between natives and non-natives. It goes both ways. So something needs to be done. But the answer to that is not segregating them, not removing them from the population, which is going to further their isolation, when they feel that, wow, the only time I can get an Aboriginal education is if I am on my own away from the white man. And then you'll have white students as well that are going to be furthered along in thinking that, see, they don't want anything to do with us. They don't want anything to do with me. They want to do their own thing. And everyone loses in that respect. Even though it's segregation with a far more pure focus or pure intent than segregation typically and traditionally has been, it still is segregation. And if they're saying that, well, teachers and students don't know enough about Aboriginal culture, well, wouldn't the best way for them to learn that be if they were in the same room learning and teaching and interacting and cooperating with Aboriginal students? You know, I have this lifelong passion for learning, and I don't want to sound trite with this, but I like asking people questions, and I've been not accused of racism, but I've had people that have said, oh my gosh, how can you ask that person about their religion or their race? Simply because I've learned that most people love to share these things. I love it if someone comes up and says, Andrew, I have a question about Christianity. I don't guarantee to know all the answers, but I'll try to find them. I find the dialogue fascinating. Heck, my boss is an atheist, and he himself has come up to me on a couple of occasions and asked me things, and I don't mind because he's doing it from a place of wanting to learn. And I've asked Muslims that I know, secular and more devout, so tell me about this, explain this. And sometimes the questions are challenging, but it's because I'm genuinely trying to understand something, same as a myriad of Jewish friends I have, including one Orthodox Jew who never hesitates to fill me in on something that I don't quite understand, because let's face it, I'm not exactly a rabbinical lawyer, nor, well, any kind of lawyer for that matter. But the reason I share all that with you is because I want people to understand how important it is to have cultural discussions. And we're going to be talking, we were talking with Stephen Crowder about this very thing. And he mentioned this and shared a story of how people are now afraid to broach that cultural topic. People are afraid, terrified of even mentioning, referencing, or admitting that they are aware of racial differences. And the same goes with cultural practices as well. And I think Aboriginal culture is rooted in race, but also a history and tradition as well, absolutely. So never segregate when you're claiming that the problem is a division, the problem is a gap, the problem is one group that doesn't understand the other group. So take them away from each other. That seems to be a huge step in the opposite direction. We got to take a break here. More Lawton Online in just a couple of moments on TheRebel.media. Stay tuned.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Yes, you heard the man. It's time for It Must Be a Liberal here on Lawton Online, scouring every corner of the globe from Edmonton to Ethiopia, from Niagara Falls to Nicaragua, finding the stories so outrageous there must be a liberal involved. And today we don't actually have to go that far. Today we don't have to go any further than Winnipeg, the great, well, not so great, but the city in Manitoba. The police have spoken out about the case of a 36-year-old Winnipeg woman who has been the victim of extortion. She began texting with a 42-year-old man after meeting in April on an online dating site. According to cops, he told her he wanted to stay but had to catch a flight home. He claimed to be a well-off lawyer. He said to test her commitment, he wanted her to pay half of his cancellation fees for his flight to stay. She agreed. He said he needed the money. More than the commitment, he continued to badger her for more. He then kept texting her, saying they had an agreement, and if she didn't pay, he'd call the police office and have them prosecute her for fraud. Then he had a friend call her posing as a police officer. And then she paid him. And then she soon had a change of heart and asked for it back. Then he asked for even more money. He said he needed money to pay for his phone bill because of all the texting they'd be doing. He threatened to call police, so she gave him the money. Then she called the real police, despite giving him money on 3 different occasions, and they began an investigation. On June 9th, they arrested him at his Winnipeg home. He's now facing 2 charges of extortion. Police have not released his name. You know, he's slime. There's no denying that. But when you meet a guy online, believe he's a lawyer without looking into him, pay him again, then pay him some more, and believe that you can go into jail for not paying him, I think it's safe to say you must be a liberal. There's no other way. Friends, I want to give a big thanks to Stephen Crowder for coming on the podcast, as well as all who emailed in and listened to the show. We'll be back next Thursday with more Lawton Online. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is TheRebel.media.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.